Evening, the 5th of April, 1815. A British garrison on the island of Java hears cannon fire. It comes from the east, rolling, heavy, unmistakable. The kind of sound a soldier's body reacts to before his mind does. Officers pull maps. Somewhere out there, they assume, a ship is in distress or a post is under attack. Troops are marched out into the dark. A vessel is sent along the coast, scanning the water for a burning hull, a mast, a signal flare, anything. They find nothing. No ship, no smoke, no enemy. The booming continues, on and off, for days. Java sits in it. Officers argue about which direction it's coming from. Somebody guesses a battle inland. Somebody else guesses a fortress under siege. Every explanation shares one assumption, that a sound this big has to mean a war, because what else makes a sound like that? They are off by about 1,200 kilometers and by an entire category of event. What they are hearing is not artillery. It is a mountain on a small island called Sumbawa clearing its throat. 5 days later, the mountain will stop clearing its throat and start screaming, and the sound of that will carry even farther. Reports of the blast reach as far as Sumatra, something like 2,000 kilometers from the source. Imagine a bang in New York being heard and mistaken for gunfire somewhere out past the Mississippi. That's the scale of noise we're talking about. And even that isn't the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is what happens after the sound stops. Because the sound is the fast part, the part that's over in days. The part that actually changes history takes a year, unfolds on the far side of the planet, and looks nothing like an eruption at all. It looks like a farmer in Vermont watching frost kill his corn in the middle of June. It looks like a family in Switzerland boiling grass to eat. It looks for months like a slightly wrong color in the sky. And nobody, not one person on Earth, has the tools to explain why. That's what I want to walk through with you. Not just what happened on that island in 1815, but how a single mountain managed to reach across an entire ocean, an entire hemisphere, and rewrite the year for people who never heard the explosion, never saw the ash, never even knew the mountain's name. The book that sent me down this particular rabbit hole is called Tambora, The Eruption That Changed the World, by a literary historian named Gillen Darcy Wood. It's not a geology textbook. It's closer to a detective story that keeps expanding its crime scene, starting on one island in the Indonesian archipelago and ending, chapter by chapter, in Swiss famine registers, Irish typhus wards, New England emigration records, and a rain-soaked villa on Lake Geneva, where a teenager started writing what would become one of the most famous novels ever published. Wood pulls a lot of that thread together from earlier eyewitness material, some of it collected at the time by Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, who was running British Java in 1815 and had the presence of mind to gather people's accounts of what they had heard and seen while it was still fresh. I want to be upfront about something before we go further. Not every claim that gets attached to this eruption is on equally solid ground. Some of what follows is about as certain as history gets. An eruption this size, in this place, in this year, is not in question. Some of it is a real number with a real range around it, the kind of honest uncertainty you get when scientists are reconstructing something from ash layers and ice cores instead of a security camera. And a couple of the more delightful claims, including one about the invention of an early bicycle, are genuinely soft, more of a maybe, than a proven chain of cause and effect. I'll tell you which is which as we go, because the honest version of this story is stranger than the exaggerated one anyway. Here's the shape of it, though, before we get into the ash and the ice cores and the frozen crops. We tend to think of disaster as a local thing. A hurricane hits a coastline. A fire burns a town. The damage has an address. What happened after Tambora breaks that assumption completely. A mountain fell in on itself on one side of the planet, and within about a year, people who had never heard of Indonesia, never would hear of it, were starving because of it, and they had absolutely no way of knowing why. The connection was invisible in real time. No shockwave reached Europe, no plume of smoke darkened American skies, just a sun that looked wrong, and a summer that never really arrived, and a mystery that would take more than 100 years to solve. Let's go back to the mountain. Before April 1815, Tambora stood somewhere around 4,300 meters, a genuinely enormous peak on the island of Sumbawa in what's now Indonesia. tall enough to be a landmark for sailors across the region. It had a name, a shape, a silhouette people had lived under for generations. It also had, unknown to anyone nearby, a chamber of magma building pressure beneath it for who knows how many years, the way pressure builds in any system that's been sealed too long. The phantom cannon fire on the 5th of April was the mountain's opening statement, an early, smaller eruption that rattled Java without anyone understanding what it was. For the next 5 days, that first blast just sits there in the record as an unsolved mystery to the people experiencing it. Soldiers marched out to find an enemy. Ships searched a coastline for a wreck. Nobody found anything because there was nothing to find in the direction they were looking. The threat wasn't lateral, it was vertical, and it was still building. Then, on the 10th of April, Tambora stopped clearing its throat. I want to slow down here because it's worth actually picturing this rather than just hearing the number. Picture the mountain's summit, the actual solid rock that had stood there long enough to have forests on its slopes, long enough to be somebody's horizon, get thrown into the sky. Not damaged, not cracked, removed. When it was over, close to 400 meters of the mountain's height was simply gone, the summit dropping from around 4,300 meters to something closer to 2,050. That's not a chunk falling off a cliff face. That's like sawing the top third off a skyscraper and firing the rubble into the stratosphere. Where did that material go? Volcanologists measuring the deposits Tambora left behind, layers of ash and pumice, some of it found in ocean sediment cores far from the island, put the total ejected volume at somewhere around 150 cubic kilometers, with published estimates in the literature, ranging roughly from 100 to 180, depending on the study. Even taking the conservative end of that range, we are talking about enough material to bury a mid-sized city under a mountain of rock, ash, and pumice taller than most skyscrapers ever built. And this went not into a valley. It went up through the part of the sky where weather happens and kept going. Scientists classify eruptions on something called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI, a scale from 0 to 8 that's logarithmic, meaning each step up represents a roughly tenfold increase in the material ejected, not a small increment. Tambora is rated a VEI 7. To give you a sense of where that sits, it is, by the measures we have, the most powerful eruption in recorded human history. Not one of the largest one we have direct historical record of. Everything bigger than a VEI 7 belongs to deep geological time, to eruptions no human witnessed, no diary described, no ship's log recorded the sound of. And eruptions at that scale are not common on a human timescale. The rough estimate, and I want to flag this clearly as an estimate because the exact recurrence rate is genuinely debated and derives statistically from a geologic record that's incomplete by nature, is that VEI 7 eruptions happen something like once or twice per 1,000 years, not once in a lifetime, once or twice in the entire span of recorded civilization since agriculture began. Tambora is, on a species timescale, recent. It happened a bit over 200 years ago. It's inside the age of the newspaper, inside the age of the thermometer, inside the age of the ship's log, which is exactly how we know as much as we do about it. Ordinary people were already writing things down when it happened. They just didn't know what they were writing about. Now, picture being on Sumbawa itself, not reading about the VEI number from a comfortable distance, but standing somewhere on that island as the 10th of April happens. The eruption doesn't just throw ash into the sky. It drives fast-moving flows of superheated gas and rock and ash down the mountain slopes, and it generates tsunamis that hit the coasts nearby. This is the part of the story that isn't slow-motion climate disruption. This is immediate, and it is close, and it kills people in the most direct way an eruption can. Then, in the weeks after the initial blast, a second, slower catastrophe sets in. Ash smothering farmland, wells, and grazing land across the region, which means starvation and disease follow the blast the way an aftershock follows an earthquake. Nobody has a clean death toll for any of this, and I think it's important to say that honestly, rather than reach for the biggest scary number, because that's exactly the kind of thing that gets exaggerated in retellings. Direct eruption deaths from the blasts, the flows, the tsunamis are estimated in the low thousands up to somewhere around 10,000. But if you widen the count to include everyone who died afterward from the famine and disease that followed the ash fall across the following months, estimates climb much higher, with some running as high as 60 to 90,000 or more. These are historical estimates, not a census. There was no census taker walking through the aftermath with a clipboard, and different sources land in very different places within that range. What's not in question, whatever the precise number turns out to be, is that this was mass death on a scale that reshaped the region. There's one more piece of that regional toll I think deserves its own weight, separate from the death count, because it's a different kind of loss entirely. The people of Tambora, the community that lived on and around that mountain, spoke their own language. It's documented in linguistic and historical scholarship that this language and the culture built around it was effectively wiped out by the eruption. Not gradually assimilated over generations, the way most languages disappear, extinguished in the course of one event by the mountain itself. It's one of history's clearest cases of an entire language being erased by a single geological moment, not a metaphor, not a slow fade, but a line you can point to on a map and a calendar and say, before this, a language was spoken here. After this, it wasn't. Sit with that for a second before we move on, because it's easy to let it slide past as one more grim statistic in a story full of them. A language is not a file that gets deleted. It's thousands of individual people, each carrying a slightly different piece of it in their heads, a joke that only works in that language, a word for a specific kind of rain, a lullaby a specific grandmother sang a specific way. All of that lived nowhere but inside those individual, mortal, breathing people. When the people are gone, so is the whole architecture built out of their memory. Most languages that die slowly over generations as speakers grow old and children stop learning the words. This one didn't get that mercy. It ended roughly the same week the mountain did. So far, this is a terrible but geographically contained story. A mountain in Indonesia destroyed a huge amount of what was near it. Awful, but local. The kind of catastrophe that, however devastating, stays where it happened. This is where most volcano stories end, because this is where the visible damage stops. But Tambora didn't stop there. And to understand what it did next, we have to go somewhere the eruption itself never physically reached, the stratosphere. Here's the plain version of the mechanism, because the jargon can wait until you've got the picture. When an eruption is powerful enough, and Tambora very much was, the column of gas and debris it throws skyward doesn't stop at the layer of atmosphere where our weather lives. It punches straight through the ceiling of that layer into the stratosphere above it, carrying not just ash, but huge quantities of sulfur dioxide gas. Ash, it turns out, is the easy part to deal with, atmospherically speaking. It's heavy. Within days to weeks, gravity does its job and it falls back down, blanketing the ground for hundreds of kilometers around the volcano, but eventually settling out of the sky entirely. If the story ended with ash, this would still be a horrific regional disaster, but it would stay regional, the same way a dust cloud from any large explosion eventually just comes back down to Earth. The sulfur dioxide is the part that doesn't behave. Once it's up in the stratosphere, it reacts with water vapor over the following weeks and converts into something else, fine droplets of sulfate aerosol. Think of it less like smoke and more like an extremely fine mist, so fine it doesn't fall the way ash does. And here's the detail that makes all the difference. The stratosphere doesn't have the weather systems that scrub the lower atmosphere clean. No rain up there. No wind turbulence washing particles back to the ground, the way a storm clears haze out of the sky you actually live under. Without that scrubbing mechanism, these aerosol droplets can persist for 1 to several years, and stratospheric winds carry them over time around the entire globe, spreading into both hemispheres, regardless of where the eruption actually happened. I want you to picture your own house for a second, because this is where the mechanism stops being abstract. Imagine a house where every room has its own door, its own life, its own weather almost, but all of those rooms share one attic. If something catches fire in a room on the ground floor, the fire itself might stay contained to that room. But the smoke doesn't respect the walls. It rises, it finds the attic. And the attic connects every room in the house whether they wanted to or not. Smoke from the room nobody else was even in fills the air 2 floors up in a bedroom that never saw a flame. The stratosphere is the atmosphere's shared attic. Tambora's sulfur didn't stay over Indonesia any more than smoke stays in the room where the fire started. It rose into the one layer of sky that belongs, in a sense, to the whole planet at once, and from there, it drifted to blanket regions that never felt so much as a tremor from the eruption itself. And once that veil is up there, spread across the globe, it does something very specific. It scatters and reflects a portion of incoming sunlight back out to space before it ever reaches the ground. Less sunlight reaching the surface means less heat reaching the surface. This isn't a theory anyone had to take on faith by the time scientists really got to study it. This exact mechanism was directly observed and measured after the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo, which gave researchers a modern instrumented case to calibrate against and effectively confirmed in real time what a Tambora-scale event does to global temperatures. The mechanism itself is not scientifically in dispute. What's still being refined through ongoing climate modeling and physical evidence pulled from ice and sediment is exactly how strong Tambora's specific effect was, and exactly how unevenly it was distributed around the globe. The estimate for how much this cooled the planet on average in 1816 is somewhere in the range of about 0.4 to 1 degree Celsius, with cooling running higher in some regions and seasons than others. Now, if you just heard that number cold, it might sound almost unimpressive. Less than a degree. You felt bigger temperature swings than that just from a cloud passing in front of the sun. That reaction, that shrug, is exactly the trap. And I want to walk you through why, because this is the part of the story where a tiny number turns out to be the whole horror. A crop doesn't experience temperature as a single number averaged over a year. It experiences a growing season, a narrow window between the last killing frost of spring and the first killing frost of autumn, and inside that window, a whole sequence of specific fragile moments. Germination needs a certain warmth. Flowering needs a certain warmth. There's a stretch in early summer where a young stalk of corn is about as tolerant of frost as bare skin is. Shave half a degree to a degree off the average temperature across a whole growing region, and you don't get a slightly colder version of the same season. You get a shorter season. The frost-free window closes in from both ends, later to start, earlier to end, by what researchers estimated something like a couple of weeks on each side. A field that needed the full length of that window to bring a crop from seed to harvest simply doesn't get it. That's the part the raw number hides. Half a degree doesn't sound like weather that kills anyone. A growing season cut 2 or 3 weeks short at each end is a plant that never finishes what it started. New England found this out first, and it found it out in the cruelest possible order. Snow fell in June of 1816. Not a freak late flurry that melts by noon. Recorded snow, recorded frost, in the middle of what should have been the safest planting month of the year. Farmers who'd already put seed in the ground, trusting a calendar that had held for generations, watched young corn blacken and collapse overnight. They replanted. July brought frost again. They replanted a second time, because what else do you do? And August brought another killing frost on top of that. 3 separate frost events inside the 3 months that were supposed to be summer in a region where an ordinary year might see none. Across the Atlantic, the mechanism was the same and the details were different. Cold, wet conditions settled over much of Europe through the growing season, drowning and chilling crops that needed sun and warmth to fill out. Grain prices climbed as harvests came in thin. Ireland, Switzerland, and parts of Germany were hit especially hard enough that the years remembered in agricultural and social history as one of the most severe subsistence crises the continent had seen in generations, arriving on the tail end of an era already prone to hunger. People who had never missed a meal in their lives went hungry. Families that had never begged did. In parts of Switzerland, accounts describe people reduced to eating grass and eating what bread could be stretched from bark and moss mixed into the flour because there wasn't enough grain to go around, and there was no way to import your way out of a shortage that was happening almost everywhere the wind had carried that veil. Hunger doesn't travel alone. It brings sickness with it. Bodies weakened by malnutrition are bodies with less to fight off disease, and populations forced into crowded relief lines and displacement are populations where disease spreads fastest. Typhus outbreaks followed the famine through parts of Europe, layering an epidemic on top of a food crisis that was already stretching further than anyone in living memory could recall. And here is the detail I keep coming back to, because it's the one that turns this from tragedy into genuine mystery. Not one of these people, not the Vermont farmer replanting his corn for the third time, not the Swiss family boiling grass, not the physicians watching typhus spread through crowded relief shelters, had any reason to connect what was happening to their sky. They didn't know a mountain had fallen in on itself in the Indonesian archipelago a year earlier. Most of them had never heard of Sumbawa. There was no news wire fast enough, no scientific instrument sensitive enough to draw a line from a volcanic island on the other side of the planet to a frosted cornfield in New England. All they had was the sky itself, and the sky, it turned out, had been trying to tell them something the entire time, if anyone had known how to read it. Through 1815 and into 1816, people across Europe and North America had been writing down what they saw overhead in diaries and in newspapers without any framework for what they were describing. A persistent high haze that didn't behave like ordinary weather, thin, dry, and stubbornly present for months rather than days. A sun dim enough at times to look at directly, something you'd never risk on an ordinary clear day. Observers in Italy recorded what they called a spotted appearance to the sun's disk. And at dawn and dusk, the sky put on a show that nobody watching it had any context for. Twilights that stretched unusually long and burned in vivid, saturated reds and oranges, night after night, far beyond what an ordinary sunset does. Nobody at the time called this a volcanic veil, because nobody at the time knew such a thing existed. What they had was a name for the daytime haze. Dry fog, they called it, because it looked something like fog but didn't behave like one. Didn't burn off with the morning sun the way real fog does. Didn't come from any moisture anyone could account for. It just sat there, day after day, a planet running the faintest possible fever, visible only to anyone who happened to look up and think, to write down what they saw. One painter, at least, seems to have been looking up and paying closer attention than most. J.M.W. Turner was working through these years, and the sunsets he put on canvas in this period are some of the most lurid, saturated, almost unnatural reds and oranges in his whole body of work. Art historians and atmospheric scientists have pointed to this since, suggesting that what Turner was painting might have been the volcanic haze itself, rendered in oil rather than recorded in a diary. I want to be honest about the shape of that claim, though it's an interpretation, a widely repeated one, but not something anyone can prove by pointing to a specific canvas and a specific ash cloud. Turner never left a note saying, "painted during the dry fog." What we have is a striking coincidence between a documented atmospheric phenomenon and a documented shift in a painter's palette, and a suggestion offered by people who study both that the two might be connected. Take it as the beautiful possibility it is, not as settled fact. Here's the part of this story that I find almost funnier than it should be, given everything that came before it. While farmers were replanting corn for the third time and families were boiling grass, a very different kind of crisis was unfolding in a rented villa on the shore of Lake Geneva, a crisis of boredom and rain and nowhere to go. Mary Shelley, not yet 20, was staying there in the summer of 1816 with Percy Shelley, with Lord Byron, with John Polidori, and the rest of their circle. This was supposed to be a summer holiday, lake views, mountain air, the kind of scenery you travel to Switzerland for. Instead, they got the ruined summer everyone else was getting. Cold, wet, confined indoors day after day by weather that refused to break, and confinement for a group of restless, brilliant, competitive writers with nothing else to do. apparently breeds its own kind of pressure. Byron proposed they each write a ghost story to pass the time. Out of that evening, in that rain, on that shore, Mary Shelley began the story that would become Frankenstein, published 2 years later in 1818. This isn't an inference or a loose thread somebody drew after the fact. It's Mary Shelley's own account of how the story began, and it's about as directly documented a piece of literary history as exists. One of the most enduring monsters in the English language exists, in a very real sense, because a volcano on the other side of the world made it rain too much in Switzerland for a group of young writers to go outside. Sit with that pairing for a second, because it's the strangest thing about this whole event. The exact same physical cause, sulfate aerosols scattering sunlight over the northern hemisphere, produced simultaneously some of the most sublime sunset paintings in Western art and a famine that killed tens of thousands of people. Beauty and catastrophe coming out of the identical haze, depending entirely on which side of comfort you happened to be standing on when it arrived. If you had food stored and a roof that didn't leak, 1816 gave you astonishing skies and a Gothic novel. If you didn't, it gave you a dead harvest and a dead child. There's a softer thread some retellings pull from here too, a suggestion that the failed harvests pushed a noticeable wave of New Englanders to pack up and head west in the following years, chasing farmland that hadn't just failed them 3 summers running. It's a plausible thing to have happened, and it's commonly repeated, but it's nowhere near as rigorously nailed down as the Shelley connection, more a reasonable inference from hard times than a number anyone's counted. And there's one more claim floating around in the popular retellings, even softer still, that the shortage of feed for horses that year pushed a German inventor named Karl Dreiss to develop an early pedalless precursor to the bicycle the following year. I'll be honest with you, that one's the flimsiest thread in the whole tapestry. It's fun to say out loud. It is not something you should walk away believing the way you should believe the Shelley story. What actually solved this mystery didn't come from a diary or a painting or a novel. It came, more than a century later, from a hole drilled straight down into ice. An ice sheet builds itself the same way a diary does, one entry at a time, except the entries are years and the pen is snowfall. Every winter lays down a new layer. Every summer, that layer compacts slightly before the next one buries it. Over centuries, over millennia, those layers stack into a cylinder of solid ice hundreds or thousands of meters deep, and buried inside each thin band is a sample of whatever was actually in the air the year that snow fell. Dust, trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere, and chemical residue washed down out of the sky by the same snow that's now entombing it. When researchers drill down and pull out one of those cylinders, a core, they're not looking at ice the way you'd look at ice in a drink. They're looking at a book, and they rate it by running instruments down its length, measuring the chemistry of each thin layer in sequence, counting bands the way you'd count rings in a tree, except each ring here can be dated to a specific year with real precision, going back centuries. And in cores pulled from both Greenland and Antarctica, opposite ends of the planet, thousands of kilometers apart, nowhere near Indonesia, nowhere near each other. Researchers found the same thing sitting in the layers that correspond to 1815 and 1816. A sharp spike in sulfate, not a gradual rise. A spike, a sudden jump in concentration that shows up like a struck match against the baseline chemistry of the ice around it, then fades back down in the years that follow as the aerosol veil that produced it finally settled and washed out of the sky for good. That's the fingerprint. That's the confession the atmosphere left behind, written into ice at both poles simultaneously, because the veil had done exactly what the mechanism predicts, spread through the stratosphere and blanketed both hemispheres, leaving the same chemical signature in Arctic snow and Antarctic snow in the same years, an ocean and a hemisphere apart from the mountain that put it there. Here's what I want you to actually feel about that, rather than just file away as a clever bit of forensic science. That spike sat frozen in the ice, undisturbed, for more than 100 years before anyone drilled down far enough and asked the right question to read it. Every single person who lived through 1816, Every farmer who replanted corn 3 times, every family in Switzerland eating grass, every physician watching typhus spread through a relief shelter died without ever knowing what that sulfate spike would eventually prove. They had the effect. They lived inside the effect for a year. Some of them lost children to the effect. But the cause was written down in a language nobody on Earth could read yet, buried under ice on 2 continents, waiting. Think about what that means for how thin the membrane is between living through history and understanding it. It is entirely possible, normal even, to be standing directly inside the consequence of an enormous, specific physical event and have absolutely no way to perceive the event itself. Not because you weren't paying attention, not because nobody was recording anything. They were, obsessively, diaries full of sky observations and frost dates and grain prices. The information existed. What didn't exist yet was the instrument capable of connecting a chemical trace in polar ice to a bad harvest 6,000 kilometers away. You can be drowning in data and still be a century away from having the one piece of understanding that makes all of it make sense. And this is where the story of Tambora actually gets more unsettling than the eruption itself, because the ice cores don't just confirm what happened in 1816. They open up an earlier mystery that's still not fully solved. Buried in those same cores, in layers dating to around 1808 and 1809, there's another sulfate spike, a real one, comparable in some respects to Tambora's, sitting there in the ice about 7 years earlier. Which means something happened before Tambora. Something big enough to load the stratosphere with its own veil of aerosols, its own dimming effect, its own quiet drag on global temperature. And to this day, nobody has conclusively identified which volcano did it. The eruption is real. It's in the ice. Its exact source, its precise location, remains debated in the scientific literature. An entire eruption, large enough to leave a global signature 2 continents wide, and we still don't know for certain which mountain to credit or blame for it. Here's why that matters for the story of 1816. And it's a point I don't want to rush past because it changes what Tambora actually was. The northern hemisphere climate that Tambora's aerosol veil landed on in 1815 was not a stable, ordinary baseline suddenly knocked sideways by one dramatic event. It was already cooling. It was in the tail end of what's called the Little Ice Age, a long stretch of generally cooler northern hemisphere temperatures that had been dragging on with debated precise causes and boundaries since roughly the 14th century. On top of that, the sun itself was running quieter than usual during this exact window, a period of reduced solar activity called the Dalton minimum, roughly spanning the 1790s through the 1820s, which on its own contributes a small additional cooling drag, entirely independent of volcanoes. And on top of both of those, there was that still unidentified 1808 or 1809 eruption, its own aerosol veil having already dimmed the sky once before Tambora ever erupted. Picture a boxer already staggering, already absorbed several rounds of body blows he hasn't fully recovered from, list already leaning, breath already short, and then the final punch lands. That punch didn't create the vulnerability. The fight had already been eroding him for rounds before it arrived. But it's the punch that puts him on the canvas, and it's the punch everyone remembers, because it's the one you can point to and say, that's the moment he went down. Tambora is that final punch. It landed on a system already weakened by a century-long cooling trend, a quiet sun, and a mystery eruption that had already primed the stratosphere once. Tambora didn't invent the crisis of 1816. It was the decisive additional forcing that tipped an already stressed climate system over an edge it had been approaching for years. Understanding it this way doesn't make the eruption less significant. If anything, it makes it more precise. Tambora gets to be exactly as responsible as it actually was, no more, no less, which is still enormous, still capable of triggering the worst subsistence crisis Europe had seen in a century, on top of everything already stacked against that particular decade. There's something almost architectural about what happened here. Once you see the shape of it clearly, and it's worth pulling back far enough to actually see the shape, rather than just the individual pieces. A single, contained, localized event, one mountain summit collapsing on one island, reached up into a layer of atmosphere that belongs to nobody and everybody at once, and reorganized it. And once that shared layer was reorganized, the consequences came back down not as one large visible disaster, but as thousands of small, disconnected, purely local feeling disasters, each one experienced by people who had no way of seeing the thread connecting their particular suffering to anyone else's. The Vermont farmer's ruined corn felt like his problem. The Swiss family's hunger felt like their problem. Nobody standing inside any single one of those local catastrophes could see that they were all downstream of the same cause, because the cause never announced itself locally. It only ever showed up as an effect, scattered and disguised as bad luck. This is not, it turns out, a shape unique to volcanoes. It's a pattern that keeps recurring at wildly different scales, whenever a contained event manages to reach a shared system big enough to distribute its consequences invisibly. Go back 66 million years to the end of the Cretaceous, and you find the same shape at a scale that makes Tambora look almost modest. A single asteroid, striking a single point on the planet's surface, didn't just devastate the region around the impact. It reorganized global climate for years afterward, in ways that ultimately ended the age of the dinosaurs. One point of impact, one shared atmosphere, and consequences that reached every corner of the globe, regardless of how far from the crater a given species happened to live. The mechanism isn't identical to Tambora's, different material thrown into the sky, different specifics of what blocked the light, but the shape is the same. Something concentrated at a single point reorganizes something shared, and the damage comes back out everywhere at once, disconnected from its source in the experience of anything living through it. Or consider a scenario that's never actually happened, but the scientists have modeled with unsettling seriousness using exactly this same physical logic: a large-scale nuclear exchange. The theorized mechanism, often called nuclear winter, doesn't rely on the blasts themselves reaching everyone on the planet. It relies on soot injected into the stratosphere by firestorms following the detonations, spreading the same way volcanic aerosols spread, settling into that shared atmospheric layer and dimming sunlight globally, for people and nations who were never anywhere near a single warhead. A localized, human-scale act of destruction translated by the shared atmosphere into a planetary one. And you don't even need the mechanism to be atmospheric for the same pattern to appear. Think about how a virus moves through a connected world. A single spillover event, one infection in one city on one specific and identifiable day, can become a globally distributed, locally experienced crisis within months, not because the atmosphere carried it, but because a different kind of shared network did. Human travel, human contact, the connective tissue of a species that moves and trades and gathers. The transmission mechanism is entirely different from a sulfate aerosol drifting on stratospheric winds. The shape of the outcome is not. One contained origin, one shared system it exploits, millions of people everywhere at once, each one experiencing what feels like their own private catastrophe, with no way of tracing it back to a market on a specific street in a specific city they've never been to. I think this is the actual underlying idea worth sitting with, underneath all the ash and ice cores and frozen cornfields. Connectedness is what makes catastrophe travel invisibly. The more connected a system is, an atmosphere, a climate, a planet of trade routes and airports, the further a single event's consequences can travel, and, cruelly, the less visible the connection becomes, the farther downstream you are from the cause. Proximity to a disaster's origin comes with at least the terrible clarity of knowing what's happening to you and why. Distance from it strips that clarity away entirely. You just get the consequence, arriving in your own specific corner of the world, dressed up as an ordinary local misfortune, indistinguishable from where you're standing, from bad luck. That's what 1816 actually was if you strip away the poetry of it. Not a single global winter blanketing the planet evenly. The impact was genuinely uneven. hitting New England and Central and Western Europe hard while leaving other regions far less touched, nothing like a uniform catastrophe spread smoothly across every latitude. It was, instead, thousands of individual, disconnected local winters, each one dressed up as an ordinary run of bad weather, each one experienced by people with no reason to suspect they were living inside the tail end of something that began on a mountain most of them would never be able to find on a map. Turn that same idea toward now, toward the actual moment you're sitting and listening to this, because the mechanism didn't retire when the ice cores finally explained it. It's still sitting there, available, waiting on the geological calendar the same way it was waiting in 1815. We are, by any reasonable count, overdue in only the loosest statistical sense. A once or twice a millennium event doesn't come with a countdown clock, and there's no scientific instrument that can tell you whether the next VEI-7 eruption is 100 years away or happening under some sleeping volcano summit while you're hearing this sentence. That uncertainty is real and it's honest, and I'm not going to dress it up as an imminent prediction, because it isn't one. But the frequency isn't the unsettling part. The unsettling part is what's changed and hasn't changed about what would happen next. What's changed is enormous, genuinely. We would not spend 5 days marching soldiers along a coastline looking for a phantom shipwreck. We would know within hours that a major eruption had occurred, roughly where and roughly how large. Satellites would track the ash column in real time. Instruments would start sampling the stratosphere for sulfur dioxide within days. Climate models, calibrated against Pinatubo and reconstructed Tambora data, would start producing forecasts for global cooling before the aerosol veil had even finished spreading. The specific ignorance that defined 1816, the not knowing, the century-long gap between living through the effect and understanding the cause, that particular kind of blindness, we've genuinely cured. Nobody today would spend 100 years wondering what turned the sky that color. What hasn't changed, and this is the part I think about more than I'd like to admit, is the exposure underneath the ignorance. We solved the not knowing. We didn't solve the not having enough. Think about what actually kept 1816 from being even worse than it was in the places it hit hardest, and what it lacked in the places it hit hardest. Local food systems in 1815 were, by necessity, close to self-sufficient. Regions grew a large share of what they ate, stored surplus against bad years. And while a catastrophic season could still overwhelm those buffers, as it plainly did, there was at least some slack built into how food moved and where it came from. Compare that to how food actually reaches you right now. Global agriculture today runs on long, efficient, tightly optimized supply chains. Crops concentrated in specific breadbasket regions and shipped enormous distances to reach the people who eat them, with comparatively little local buffer held in reserve anywhere along that chain, because buffer is inefficient, and modern agriculture has spent generations optimizing inefficiency out of the system. That optimization is exactly why food is as cheap and abundant as it is in ordinary years. It is also exactly the kind of tightly strung system that has less slack to absorb an extraordinary one. Picture the whole arrangement as a tightrope. The 1815 version of that tightrope was slack, uncomfortable, prone to swaying badly in a strong wind, but slack has given it. The modern version is pulled taut, efficient, barely swaying at all in ordinary conditions, which feels like stability right up until something hits it that a taut rope can't absorb the way a slack one could. A Tambora-scale eruption today would land on a global food system that knows exactly what's happening to it in real time, with total clarity about the mechanism, and less local, physical, and agricultural capacity to simply absorb a 2 or 3 week shortening of growing seasons across multiple breadbasket regions simultaneously than the comparatively primitive world of 1815 had. That's the trade we've actually made, whether or not anyone ever framed it to you as a trade. We exchanged blindness for exposure. 1816 was suffered by people who couldn't see what was happening to them, but who were, in a strange way, cushioned by a world that hadn't yet optimized away its own redundancy. We are the opposite. We would see it coming hour by hour, and we would understand the mechanism completely. and none of that understanding would put a single extra kilogram of grain into a supply chain built to run lean. I don't say any of this to be grim for its own sake. I say it because I think the honest version of awe includes this kind of unease, the recognition that understanding a mechanism and being safe from it are two entirely different achievements, and we've only actually finished one of them. Tambora's mountain is still there, diminished, on that island, a permanent physical record of what its own collapse cost it in elevation. The stratosphere above your head right now is the exact same shared layer it was in 1815, still capable of carrying a veil around the whole planet if something big enough ever punches through into it again. The only thing that's really changed over 200 years is how quickly we'd find out. Consider just how concentrated modern staple crop production actually is, because this is the detail that makes the tightrope image more than a metaphor. A relatively small number of specific growing regions on Earth account for an outsized share of the calories the rest of the planet depends on. Vast stretches of a handful of countries doing the majority of the work for wheat, for corn, for rice, for soy. That concentration is a feature of the modern system, not an accident of geography. It's cheaper, more efficient, more productive per hectare to grow enormous quantities of a single crop in the regions best suited to it and ship the surplus everywhere else, rather than have every region try to grow a little of everything for itself, the way subsistence agriculture once did almost everywhere. The problem is what that concentration does to risk. In 1815, an eruption's aerosol veil, spreading unevenly across the globe, happened to hit hardest in exactly the regions people were already growing their own food in, which was brutal for those specific regions, but it meant the damage, while severe, was distributed across countless individual farms and villages and households, each absorbing its own share of a spread-out blow. A modern equivalent wouldn't need to touch every farm on Earth to do comparable damage. It would only need its unevenness to happen to land on the handful of concentrated regions that the rest of the planet has, by design, come to depend on. Shorten the growing season by that same 2 or 3 weeks at each end in exactly the wrong handful of bread baskets, and the shock doesn't stay local to those regions the way it mostly did in 1815. It propagates outward through the same supply chains that make food so cheap and available in an ordinary year, because those chains were built for efficient distribution of surplus, not for absorbing simultaneous shortfall at the source. There's a name economists and food security researchers use for the kind of buffer that used to exist almost everywhere by default, and now has to be deliberately engineered back in at real cost against efficiency: slack. Grain reserves held in storage rather than sold, redundant supply routes that cost more to maintain than the single cheapest one, diversified planting across regions that aren't all vulnerable to the same weather at the same time. All of it is, by the pure logic of efficiency, waste, right up until the 1 year in 1,000 when it isn't, when it's the only thing standing between a shortened growing season and an empty shelf. Most of the 20th and 21st century's agricultural progress has run in the opposite direction, trimming exactly this kind of redundancy out of the system in the name of lower prices and higher yields, because for generation after generation, the eruption never came. And slack you never need looks, from any given year's vantage point, indistinguishable from waste. That's the quiet, specific unease underneath the awe of this whole story, and I don't think it needs exaggerating to land. It isn't that disaster is coming. It's that the exact same physical mechanism that starved a continent 200 years ago hasn't gone anywhere, still sits latent under however many mountains on Earth are capable of it, and the world it would land on today has spent 2 centuries getting better at explaining such an event within hours, and in the same stretch of time, quietly worse at simply absorbing one. Go back for a moment to the days immediately following the 10th of April, because there's a detail in the eruption's immediate aftermath I haven't given you yet, and it's worth sitting inside properly rather than skipping past as a footnote to the numbers. On islands near Sumbawa, in the days after the climactic eruption, witnesses recorded something that's hard to fully picture unless you slow down and imagine actually living through it: total darkness for extended periods in the middle of what should have been daylight hours. Not an overcast, gloomy afternoon. Darkness thick enough that the sun simply wasn't there anymore, blotted out entirely by the sheer density of ash suspended in the air above and around these islands. Ash fell hundreds of kilometers from the volcano, settling over landscapes, roofs, water supplies, and lungs, far beyond the zone that had felt the ground shake or heard the initial blast. Picture waking into a morning that never becomes a morning. No sunrise, or a sunrise so filtered and choked by suspended ash that it might as well not have happened. People going about whatever desperate business the day required, trying to find clean water, trying to account for family members, trying to move away from the coast after word of the tsunami spread, doing all of it by whatever weak, ash-filtered light made it through, or not at all. Ash this fine doesn't just block light. It gets into water sources, settles on whatever crops hadn't already been destroyed, coats surfaces in a way that makes ordinary daily tasks, the ones nobody thinks about until they're impossible, suddenly difficult, or dangerous. Breathing itself, in the thick of an ashfall like this, becomes something you have to think about, filtering air that shouldn't require filtering. This is the piece of the story that stays entirely regional, entirely contained to the islands near the eruption, and it's worth marking clearly as distinct from everything that came after, because the two kinds of catastrophe Tambora produced were genuinely different in kind, not just in degree. The darkness over Sumbawa and its neighboring islands was immediate, physical, and visible. You could point to the ash in the air and say, correctly, this is what's killing the light. What happened afterward, the fine sulfate mist rising into the stratosphere and drifting invisibly around the planet, produced no darkness anyone could point to. No ash fell in Vermont, no plume was visible over Switzerland. The regional catastrophe announced itself with total, undeniable physical darkness at midday. The global catastrophe that followed announced itself with almost nothing at all. A slightly duller sun, a slightly redder sunset, a growing season that quietly failed to arrive on schedule. The nearer the disaster, paradoxically, the more obvious its cause. The further it traveled, the more it disguised itself as ordinary bad luck, which is exactly the same shape this whole story keeps returning to at every scale it touches. Go back one last time to that garrison on Java. Soldiers marched out into the dark to find a ship that didn't exist, listening to a sound they had no framework for. They weren't foolish. They were doing exactly what any of us would do with a fact too large for the explanation on hand, reaching for the nearest familiar story, a battle, a wreck, a war, because the true cause hadn't been invented yet as a thing you could even suspect. We know better now. We know about stratospheres and sulfate veils and ice that keeps a record nobody thought to ask it for. But knowing the mechanism was never the same as being safe from it, and I think that's the part of this story that stays with you longest, if it stays with you at all. Not the mountain, not the ash, but the year of frost and grass and rain that followed it, suffered entirely by people looking up at a sky gone strange, with no way of knowing that 1,200 kilometers away, a summit they'd never seen had simply stopped being there. Look up sometime soon at an ordinary evening sky, red at the edges the way skies sometimes are, for no reason you'll ever be told. Most of the time, it really is nothing. But somewhere on this planet, right now, there's a mountain doing exactly what Tambora's did before anyone knew to watch it, quietly, patiently on a timescale none of us will ever get to see coming.